Hey Saints, well, it's been a little while. Pretty exciting everything that's going on in the world. I'm sure you would agree with the Sudan and Libya sort of falling in line with the rest of the Magog alliance and um, even some of the craziness in Venezuela. It looks like Russia and China kind of forming a direct conflict with the U.S. trying to support the new Venezuelan government. Um, but we got to keep our nose to the grindstone here and keep our Bible study going. This is kind of a follow up and an addition to some concepts I've done before. I'd have to say that what we're talking about here is what does Revelation 21 and 22 speak to? And um, I'd have to say it's 80+% of the commentaries I read of dispensational, you know, uh, theologians talk about Revelation 21 and 22 being the eternal state. And, years ago, I read or listened to teaching um, from Jack Kelly, which Grace Through Faith is his website. Now, he's passed on. I actually found this out a couple of weeks ago that he passed on way back in 2015. I hadn't been following his stuff very much. Probably probably last time I looked was maybe 2015. So um, I wasn't aware of his passing, but he had really done some really great Bible teaching and some audio uh, expositional stuff, and I really liked him. And one of the observations he made along the way was that Revelation 21 and 22 couldn't be the eternal state. And he gave reasons, and actually I didn't for this video go back and look up all of his passage references and why, but I just remember him making the argument that there appears to be sin depicted in the eternal state, if that's the way you view it. And then he said it didn't make sense in terms of Isaiah 65, which describes the New Jerusalem, which Revelation 21 also describes the New Jerusalem. So he said, read those in context. How would that be the eternal state? And his supposition was Revelation 20 is one complete thought. It's an outline on the judgment of the wicked. But that, unfortunately, because of chapter break, you miss the fact that Revelation 21 is actually um, continuing the progress of the story that you get before Revelation 20, which is really the Jesus returning to the earth and setting up the millennial reign. And that might seem like a nit, but it's a big chunk of text if you look Revelation 21 and 22. And so if it's true that it's not the eternal state, it's a pretty meaningful catch. I mean, it's a big chunk of the Bible to get out of order and to have in the wrong place. And so that always kind of stuck with me. And this video really was prompted by reading a book from Dr. Andy Woods. He put one out called The Kingdom, I think it was, or The Coming Kingdom. It was a great book. I went on a little driving vacation with some family. It got me plenty of hours as a passenger in the car, and I was able to crank through the book, which is 450 pages, and it was an awesome book. It just really cemented the view of the kingdom, and it talked about other views in the church broadly of what the kingdom is and how it's used in scripture, and it sort of defended a line of thinking about the kingdom, at least from our standpoint right now, is eschatological, meaning the kingdom that's referenced in the Bible is really what we know as the millennial reign, which here you go. Here's what's this video about. And so it's a future state. Now there is obviously the general kingdom. God's in heaven from before creation. He's been king on the throne. And you see that general kingdom referenced, even in the Old Testament. Nebuchadnezzar, I think it was after the grass eating event, he talked about, Daniel's king being on the throne forever, and there's other references like that. But, the kingdom, most of the Old Testament was to the Jewish people under the law. The kingdom meant something very specific. It was God living with his people, his promised people, and the wealth of the nations flowing to him. And it was the fulfillment of the Davidic covenant where a descendant of David would always be on the throne. It was the fulfillment of the remainder of the Abrahamic covenant, the land grant to the Jewish people from the Euphrates to the Nile, right? It has to take place. The kingdom, as it was understood in the Old Testament, has to yet take place with God on the throne, Jesus on the throne, literally in Jerusalem, or there's a ton of Old Testament scripture that wouldn't have been fulfilled. And so the millennial reign's got to happen. The book laid out awesome argument why it doesn't really exist today on earth. People talk about the kingdom is within you, quoting that Luke passage. And actually, if you want to go do a little study on that Luke passage, you'll find out, I think it's Luke 17, don't hold me to that one, that within you is probably a poor translation. It's within reach, it's within grasp. It's the same concept. When Jesus was walking on the earth, he was giving an earnest offer to the Jewish people that if they would accept him as Messiah, he would establish the kingdom, but they didn't. They rejected him. And so the kingdom was near, but it wasn't here. And this book by Dr. Andy Woods really breaks down all these arguments again, and it's a great read. So with that background, then Dr. Andy Woods closes his arguments, I guess several times within the book, but definitely toward the end of the book, he talked about Revelation 21 and 22 being in the eternal state. And I just went, after all that good stuff, really, because he is such a good author and researcher. And I had before, and I tried again, to contact his ministry via email, and both to him and his, I forget what the person that co-pastors his church with him at Sugar Land Bible. But I tried contacting the co-pastor to ask this question. I asked him to please redirect me because, I gave him the arguments about Revelation 21 and 22 having verses showing that there was sin existing in this, quote, eternal state. How could that be if in Revelation 20 you have the great white throne judgment and death and sin is thrown into the lake of fire? How could that be? And I didn't receive a response. And not that you necessarily expect one. I mean, I'm sure they get hundreds of emails a day and they don't have time for everybody's silliness, but that one gets me stirred up. And so I'm coming back to this video now. And I want to outline Revelation 20 and just show how that's the judgment of the wicked. And then I want to get into this argument a little bit more. And then I want to add at the end some reinforcement. And this is sort of the new stuff that happened at the coffee shop the other morning. I just went, there it is again, in Romans 8. So that's the plan for today, saints. Let's start out in Revelation 20. Okay, so, the first thing talked about is there's 1,000-year reign coming. So an angel come down from heaven having the key to the bottomless pit and a great chain in his hand. And he laid hold of the dragon, the serpent, the devil, Satan, and bound him for 1,000 years, cast him into the pit. And then there's 6 times in these passages here where we find out it's 1,000 years. And then, this is the argument is this whole thing is about judgment on the wicked. And so first you see Satan bound, and then the story continues that he's going to be loosed out. And then here's the second Gog Magog reference, gather them together for battle. And then, he's going to be cast in the lake of fire with the beast and the false prophet at the end of the 1,000 years. And here's the rest of the judgment of the wicked. So you got the main wicked, Satan, and you got the false prophet and the Antichrist, the beast, in the lake of fire. And here's the rest. The great white throne judgment is the rest. And, everyone who's not found in the book of life was cast into the lake of fire. And so, and this is the second death. So when is the second death, and when is all this casting in the lake of fire? It's at the end of the 1,000 years. So the classic teaching then is you get to Revelation 21, verse 1, and people start interpreting, hey, we're at the end of the 1,000 years. This is the eternal state. Here comes the new heavens and the new earth, right? So I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven was passed away. And really, depending on the translation you pick, let me look at ISV, then I saw a new heavens and new earth. So, then would have to be a reference to the last verse of Revelation 20, right? The end of the 1,000 years. But the Greek word that's in there isn't necessarily the follow-on. It's a conjunction, but it could just mean and, like this, like the King James Version, right? So don't take that one as your cue. This whole idea of and could be, like I say, the next thing that the Revelator, John, is going to see. So he saw this whole picture in 20 of the judgment of the wicked, and now he's going to see the new heavens and the new earth, not necessarily timing-wise at the end of the 1,000 years. We're picking up the story in Revelation 21:1. And so what would that make Revelation 20? It becomes, a big parenthetical thought that you go from Revelation 19, the marriage supper of the Lamb being announced, and the rider on the white horse, Jesus, returning with all of his saints, being King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And then you got the beast and the false prophet were thrown into the lake of fire. And now the whole discussion of the rest of the judgment of the wicked, right? So it becomes a parenthetical thought about the judgment of the wicked that falls on the heels of the, beast and the false prophet being thrown into the lake of fire. And I know that's a big parenthetical. Usually parenthetical thoughts are a verse or two. And here we've got like a whole chapter, a whole idea of the judgment of the wicked being announced, and then to say, oh, we're going all the way back to the setup of the millennial reign. But I actually think this is the case. And so, the question is, are these verses here, 21, 1 through 8, talking about the eternal state? And it's talking about the new heavens and the new earth up here, and the new city, Jerusalem, coming down from God of heaven, prepared as a bride. And that should actually ring some bells. You guys remember in Revelation 3, well, let's go look at it. Here, the Church of Philadelphia, the one without a negative word in the letters to the churches. Behold, I come quickly. Hold fast, thou which take that crown. Him that overcometh, I will make a pillar in the temple of my God, and he'll go out no more. And I will write upon him the name of my God, and the name of the holy city of my God, which is New Jerusalem, which cometh down out of heaven from my God, and I'll write upon him my new name. So where's the home of the church? It's New Jerusalem, right? That, I think that's just like clear, but I suppose someone can debate anything. So if our home is New Jerusalem, and in Revelation 3, it's the New Jerusalem that it's coming down out of heaven, right? Then this new heavens and new earth concept is in context coming with New Jerusalem, right? And so, and what is it? It's the home of the church. And what happens in the new heavens and new earth? Talk about his people will dwell with him. Well, now think about the millennial reign. God's coming down, new heavens, new earth with his saints in their eternal state, in their eternal bodies, right? And, obviously we don't have tears or anything else like that. There won't be any more sorrow, but we do know that in the rest of the world, eventually, toward the end of the 1,000 years, there is one last great rebellion, right, led by Satan that gets put down, that reference to the Gog-Magog war that happens at the end. So, it's questionable maybe just looking at the span of verses here. Are we in the eternal state? God's wiped away all our tears. There's no more death, no more sorrow. Is the context everybody in the world at this point, or is the context the New Jerusalem? Is that the context coming out of heaven as a bride adorned for her husband? And inside of that, there's no more tears and no more death and no more crying. And that's my argument, is that the description of these verses is within the context of New Jerusalem, the saints in their eternal bodies coming down from heaven that don't experience tears and suffering and death, and we're an example, right, to the rest of the earth that just got through the tribulation period. And then you see here, he that overcometh shall inherit all things, and I will be his God, and they shall be my son. But the fearful, unbelieving, abominable, and murderers, and whoremongers, and sorcerers, and idolaters, and liars shall have their part in the lake of fire, which burns with brimstone. Will have, and so if we were really in the eternal state, why is this passage here anymore in what he's seeing? You'd be beyond that in the eternal state. And is this just a warning to the current people reading the book that they'll have their part in the lake of fire, which is the second death? I guess that's one way to read that. And now you get down to the description of the New Jerusalem. And look at in the very first verse here. And there came unto me one of the seven angels, which had the 7 vials full of the last 7 plagues. Well, timing-wise now, when in John's vision is this the last 7 plagues? When does it happen? Well, it happens in the bowl judgments, right at the end of the bowl judgments in 16. So one of the last 7 plagues is right at the end of the tribulation. And so now you have right here one of those angels, and timing wise, the last 7 plagues were the bowl judgments. I will show you the bride, the Lamb's wife. He carried me away in a great high mountain and showed me the great city, holy Jerusalem, descending out of heaven from God. Well, bang, there you go. Doesn't it speak to what John is seeing? It's not a then, it's a, and the next topic John is being shown after the tribulation period and the return of Christ with his saints. He describes the judgment of the wicked, and now he's coming to the next topic, which is New Jerusalem and the new heavens and the new earth, and the city that is the eternal city of the saints, New Jerusalem. I think that makes the most sense, because now he has this long description of the 1,500 mile by 1,500 mile square city that's coming down out of heaven. And I used to make this other argument, which I still think is a good one. Think about the end of the tribulation. Think about the end of the last 7 plagues. What condition is the earth in when Jesus returns? Well, all the oceans are blood. The whole earth has been burnt up. And, look at the judgments and the trumpet judgments in particular. A third of the earth burns up. I think the seal judgment's part of the earth burns up. So the earth is burned, scorched. You've got hundreds of millions, probably a billion plus dead warriors slain coming down, the Battle of Armageddon. You've got, nuclear attack. If you think about the descriptions you see in how they marked where the bones were, but they wouldn't touch it, right? Probably a nuclear or biological attack across the Middle East. Obviously the U.S. isn't referenced in Bible prophecy, likely. So what happened to our hemisphere? And so does God then set up and say, okay, here's the reign of Christ living with you, in this complete disaster, and leaves it that way for 1,000 years? No, I'm going to argue the new heavens and new earth is a regeneration of, the earth, kind of like what happened after the flood, and possibly, depending on how you read Genesis 1, verse 2, what happened way back at the beginning. And I think that's the setup. Then the millennial reign is a rejuvenated, regenerated earth. And now it makes a lot of sense on a ton of other passages. So if you put into your Google, I think I did the search on New Jerusalem, you'll see the related passages. I just copied them here. There's tons talking about the setting for the New Jerusalem and the new heavens and the new earth. And I'm just going to pick on one of them because I think it's telling. So if you look at right here in Revelation 21, you got the new heavens and the new earth coming down, for the old had passed away and there was no more sea. Well, it's full of blood, right? And the holy city, and all this is happening. My argument is, as part of the setup of the millennial reign, a regenerated earth, where the lion will lay down with the lamb, and the, whatever, the kid will have his hand in the cobra's den and whatever, and doesn't get hurt. That makes sense then for the 1,000-year reign. And let me just take you to Isaiah 65 and see if you can see that as well. Isaiah. So let's outline this one without draining it. So judgment is described on Israel. First, it actually alludes to the Gentiles being saved. I am sought of them that asked not for me. I am found of them that sought me not. Behold me unto a nation that was not called by my name. Well, there's the Gentiles. That was a nation. I have spread out my hands all day long unto a rebellious people, which walketh in a way that was not good after their own thoughts, a people that provoked me to anger continually in my face, that sacrifice in the gardens and burnt incense on altars of brick, which remain among the graves, lodged in the monuments, which eat swine's flesh and broth and abominable things. And he's picking apart here the Jews or the Israelites, that they're doing all the abominable things, because the Gentiles weren't given commands not to eat swine's flesh. It's a criticism on the keeping of the law of the Jews. And then he says he won't keep his silence, and their iniquities of the fathers will be punished, right? And but then he talks about the tribulation period. Thus saith the Lord, as the new wine is found in a cluster, and one saith, destroy it not, for a blessing is in it, so I'll do for my servant's sake. They'll not destroy them all, and I'll bring forth a seed out of Jacob and out of Judah, an inheritor of my mountains, and my elect shall inherit it. My servant shall dwell there. And here's the Israelites that make it into the millennial reign, right? And what do you have? You have that discussion of his servants, the Israelites, being blessed that make it in the millennial reign. And right away after that discussion, for behold, I'll create a new heavens and new earth. The former shall not be remembered or come to mind. And be glad and rejoice ever in it that which I create. For behold, I create Jerusalem a rejoicing and her people a joy. and I will rejoice in Jerusalem in the joy of my people, and the voice of the weeping shall not be heard in her, nor the voice of crying. And so there you go. The context of the new heavens and new earth from the Old Testament is right on the heels of God saying he's going to restore the rebellious children of Israel, and it's at the timing wise the setup of the millennial reign. And look at here, what do we have after that new heavens and new earth? The wolf and the lamb shall feed together, the lion shall eat straw like a bullock, the dust shall be the serpent's meat. They shall not hurt or destroy at all in my holy mountain, saith the Lord. And so there's the idyllic state, and that could actually be a reference directly to what happens inside the New Jerusalem. But set that aside for a sec. Timing wise, that's at the beginning of the millennial reign, will at least be my argument. And now I just want to add this part that I had from my little coffee study the other morning. If you go to Romans 8:19 to 23, listen to what Paul is saying here. For the earnest expectation of the creature waiteth for the manifestation of the sons of God. And now in the commentary, you get creature translated a couple of different ways. Let me just show you another translation here. For the creation is eagerly awaiting the revelation of revelation of God's children. Well, when are God's children revealed? Well, we just kind of talked about that. We return to earth with Christ, Revelation 19, when the millennial reign is set up. So the creation has become subject to futility through nothing it did, not by anything it did. The one who subjected it did so in certainty that the creation itself would also be set free from corrupting bondage in order to share the glorious freedom of God's children. Well, when was it subjected in bondage? Well, at the fall. Remember the judgment of Adam and Eve? When they were kicked out of the garden, he said, now the earth will produce thorns and briars, right? And so the whole creation was set to corruption. And so, as part of the restoration of all things, Jesus has to reverse, everything that was lost in the fall. And so he's got to restore man, he's got to restore the kingdom, and he's got to restore the creation. And so we're being told that when the revelation of God's children happens, he's going to then also reverse the fall of creation. And that's what we're getting here. Creation will be set free from corrupting bondage in order to share the glorious freedom of God's children. Bang. For we know that all the rest of creation has been groaning with the pains of childbirth up to the present time. However, not only the creation, but we who have the first fruits of the Spirit also groan inwardly as we await for our adoption, the redemption of our bodies. And there's the comparison. You're groaning until what? Until you receive the eternal version of your bodies, humans wise, and also creation is going to receive its eternal state. And when does that happen? It happens at the revelation of God's children. Let's see how other passages render that. For the creation waits for eager longing for the revealing of the sons of God. And again, our bodies are changed in a moment, in a twinkling of an eye. 1 Corinthians 15:50 through 52, we're caught up to heaven, but we're not revealed back to the earth until the return, with coming on the clouds with Christ. We're returning to earth. That's the revealing. So that's when creation gets overturned and it gets its eternal state at the revealing of the sons of God. When is that? Well, I'll argue that really is the description then we're picking up in Revelation 21, starting with verse 1, and it's there all over the Old Testament. And timing wise, I think it happens obviously right at the beginning of the millennial reign. So I hope that was interesting, saints. Again, I don't know if I've read any other commentary besides that Grace Through Faith commentary that put me on this track, that Jack Kelly. But I sure appreciate it because, again, once you get stuff right, all of a sudden all these passages click together in the right order and it all makes sense. There isn't weird, outlying passages like sin and death existing outside of the Jerusalem during, quote, the eternal state in Revelation 21 and 22, which you get in most commentaries. Let me just show you one more verse in Revelation 22 since I'm sitting there, and it kind of reinforces the point. So behold, I'm coming soon and bringing my recompense with me to pay each one for what he has done. I am the Alpha, the Omega, the first and the last, the beginning and the end. Blessed are those who wash their robes so that they may have the right to the tree of life and that they may enter the city by the gates. So the city, New Jerusalem, because outside of the city are dogs and sorcerers and sexually immoral and murderers and idolaters and everyone who loves to and practices falsehood. Again, if this is the eternal state, how do you have all of this sin occurring outside of New Jerusalem? But if it's a millennial reign, that's exactly what we know happens, is New Jerusalem comes down. It's the dwelling place and the home of the saints. Nobody that's impure is allowed to enter. And yet outside of it, during the 1,000 years, we know there still is the people that came through the tribulation period in their mortal bodies. Now, yes, they accepted Christ and they enter the kingdom, but as they start to have kids and all that, they're still subject to their fallen nature. And so outside are dogs, sorcerers, sexually immoral, murderers, idolaters, and everyone who loves to practice falsehood could not be the eternal state. And so I'll just leave you there, saints. Hopefully that study is a little bit of a blessing. And I think we're going home soon, obviously. What has it been? 6-7 years of videos talking about the rapture of the church and every possible end time thing I could get my hands into. So I've been thinking we're close for a long time, but boy, how many more things could possibly happen? I guess I want to leave with, if anybody is watching this long and gets to the end of this and is unsure about whether they'll have their part in the eternal New Jerusalem or not, you can see here, God is not playing around. Anybody that justifies their own sin is not going to be in the eternal state. You're going to have your part in the lake of fire, Revelation 20. And those sins, you say, well, I don't do this, I don't do that. Read Matthew 5. Jesus' commentary on the Sermon on the Mount was talking about that if you think of things in your heart, even that is subject to judgment. So if you look at a woman with lust, you've committed adultery already in your heart. If you get angry with somebody, you've committed murder in your heart. Nobody is going to get to this eternal state without repenting, accepting Christ's death, burial, and resurrection, as the atonement for their sin. You're not going to work your way out of the problem. Read Ephesians 2. For grace you've been saved by faith, but not of yourself. It's a gift of God so that no one can boast, and so just surrender, say, Lord, I'm a sinner, both in thought and in deed, and nobody can escape having sinful thoughts, right? And put your full trust in Christ. And then you're going to be in New Jerusalem, saints, and it's going to be eternal. We heard that here, that will be the eternal city, and it will be perfect. And do that. And I'm going to call you brother and sister in Christ for eternity. And God bless, saints. We got to be close.